Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. Today I'm going to do a very brief video about Sandra Bland. And many people are familiar with this case. This is a woman who was from the Chicago area who was recently hired to work in Prairie View, Texas. And while she was in Texas, she was stopped by the police, arrested, and jailed. And later, she died while in custody. And there's a dispute about whether or not she committed suicide or whether or not she was actually lynched by the police. The police claim that she committed suicide. They say that the video evidence shows that no one entered her cell at the time in question. And based on that, they're saying that she committed suicide. And from what I understand, there's an autopsy report that also claims that she committed suicide. However, the FBI and state and local officials are conducting their own investigation to find out the cause of her death and to find out what happened to Sandra Bland. And I'm glad that they are conducting the investigation because she died under suspicious circumstances. The sheriff who arrested her has a history of engaging in racist or action and covering up racist behavior. And I'll post a link to that article that talks about his history. As soon as I get a chance, I'll post that article. But so serious questions are raised about her death. And then there was a video of her talking about her depression and her dealing with post-traumatic stress syndrome. So people are using that to say that perhaps she committed suicide. So right now, we don't know what happened with certainty. We don't know if she committed suicide or if she was actually lynched. So that investigation continues. But I frankly find it very hard to believe that someone would take their own life after they just got a great new job. And based on the comments from her family thinks that she would never do anything like this. But we'll have to just wait and find out what the investigation reveals. So I won't make any rush to judgment or any claims at this point until I have the results of this investigation. But for this video, I want to focus on Sandra Bland and the sheriff's conduct and use this as a teachable moment. Uh, First of all, this police officer shouldn't have escalated the situation. And that's exactly what he did. Here we have a simple stop for failing to signal a turn. This officer obviously observed that Sandra Bland was irritated by being stopped by the police. Instead of de-escalating the situation and simply writing her a ticket or giving her a warning, this officer essentially antagonized her by asking her questions, by asking her what's wrong, basically, and by demanding that she put out a cigarette in her own car. She's in her own vehicle. She has every right to smoke cigarettes in her own car. So there was no reason for this officer to instruct her to put out the cigarette. Obviously, he should have known that such an instruction would have uh, created some kind of reaction out of a woman that he clearly saw was irritated. I'm sure in police lessons or in the academy, they teach, or they're supposed to teach, officers about how not to escalate a situation. Because there is no way that a simple stop for a traffic violation should turn into an arrest. It shouldn't turn into an incident where someone is thrown to the ground. And right before this officer stopped her, he stopped somebody else for something. And this is what police do. They find a reason to stop you, to harass you, basically, to interrupt your day. So this officer shouldn't have escalated the situation. And that's the bottom line with respect to this officer. But let's talk about Sandra Bland. She also made some errors as well. When you're stopped by the police and you're alone on some road in some southern town or any town for that matter, that is not the time to demonstrate against the police officer. That is not the time to have a Black Lives Matter demonstration or protest. It simply isn't. That's if you want to leave the scene without being arrested, if you want to leave the scene without being harmed, if you want to leave the scene alive, then surely you would not try to engage in some kind of argument or protest with the police officer. Now, from the minute that officer began to talk to Sandra Bland, she immediately had an attitude. And I understand that because when these police bother you for some frivolous reason, it's easy to get upset. And I've been in that situation where I've been irritated by the police. But you don't have to express an attitude to the police. You don't have to become argumentative with the police because you are only inviting problems. You are only inviting potential danger when you do so. So that's my first word of advice to anybody that's being stopped by the police. Don't argue with the police. Don't be argumentative with the police. Next, this officer told her to put out a cigarette. And as I said before, she had every smoke a cigarette in her vehicle. But it's a simple matter. It's just a cigarette, for goodness sakes. You know, it's just a cigarette. I mean, it can't hurt you to simply put the cigarette out, even though you have every right to smoke it. So instead of arguing with the cop over something as minor as smoking a cigarette, just put the cigarette out. Next, the officer, when she refused to put out the cigarette and began to argue with the officer, he told her to come out of the vehicle. Instead of doing so, she refused to do so and continued to argue with this officer. That gave that officer, at least in his mind, an excuse to pull out a taser, what looked like a taser, and aim it at her and began to actually struggle with her and pull her from the vehicle. See, if she simply just listened to the officer and not argue with the officer, he wouldn't even reach that point where he tried to pull her out of the vehicle or commanded her to get out of the vehicle. She would have simply received her warning or her ticket and she would have been on her way. But instead, she wanted to argue with this officer. Instead, she wanted to disobey his command and engage in some Black Lives Matter protests. So he ends up pointing this weapon at her, and she eventually ends up being outside of the car. And it doesn't stop there. She continues to argue with this officer, merely escalating the whole incident. And eventually he ends up putting handcuffs on her. And apparently it doesn't stop there. Now, there's no footage of their interaction after the handcuffs or even once the handcuffs are put on, from what I remember. So we don't see what happened. We don't see the actual struggle between them. But apparently, based on the conversation that you can overhear, apparently she refused to comply. Apparently there was some kind of struggle after she had the handcuffs on and she was eventually thrown to the ground. So that's the next thing. You never engage in any kind of physical altercation with the police. You should never engage in such conduct because that gives the police an excuse to arrest you, to harm you, and even in some cases to kill you. And instead of just like using Black Lives Matter as a slogan, people need to use common sense and demonstrate that their life matters by not struggling with these police officers, by not engaging them in an argument. As many have said before, it's better to leave the scene without being arrested, without being harmed, without being killed. And then at that point, you can raise your legitimate complaints and issues with the police department. But instead, you have this young woman who's thrown to the ground and arrested for something very simple because both of the people involved allowed the incident to escalate. And eventually, this woman ends up dead. So we need to use this as a lesson for our youth about how to deal with these police. And the police need to use this as a lesson for how they should not conduct police stops. See, of course, we can't behave our way out of police brutality as a systemic problem. But on the individual level, there's that we can do differently to have different outcomes. So with that, I'll leave you in peace, and I welcome your feedback and your comments. And I will post links to the dash cam footage so you can see it for yourself. And I will also post a link to the pedestrian video that was captured as well, and to the article about this sheriff and his history of racism. Peace.